Hαίrete friends, welcome to Classics in Kelly, your weekly dive into some of the ancient world's wackiest facts. I'm Mark Reyes, and today we're going to be talking about the bones of monsters and how they freaked out people in the ancient world. If you're interested in diving deeper into this topic later, absolutely start off with The First Fossil Hunters by Adrian Mayer. Great book. So obviously I'm no paleontologist, but from what I understand, most of the bones that one could find in the Mediterranean are not dinosaurs. They don't go back that far. They're more from the Ice Age and roughly that time period. So you can find things like bones from mammoths or bones from giant prehistoric rhinoceroses or giraffes, all kinds of cool stuff. And you can find it by actively going and digging for it, but sometimes these bones get exposed by just various natural forces. And obviously these fossils don't just exist now, they were there in the ancient world as well. So it wasn't unheard of for some farmer to be out digging in his field and to randomly come across a giant femur or skull. And what Adrian Mayer's book is all about is looking at those instances and how ancient people reacted to and tried to interpret these giant bones. Our modern English word fossil is the son or grandson of the Latin word fossilis, which actually doesn't mean the same thing as fossil. It just means anything cool that you dig out of the ground. So it could be a gem, a shiny rock, a shell, some amber, or bones, just any cool shit that you dig out of the ground. And there was also a rough understanding of petrifaction. So for example, if you look at Aristotle, he says that there is a drying exhalation of the earth that causes the solidifying of bones. So again, not very specific, but generally on the right track. And the ancient world also has a fairly loose conception of time. They certainly don't have like the Pleistocene age or anything like we do, but they do understand that these bones are probably pretty old. And generally they attribute these bones when they find them to the Mythic Age. And nobody knows exactly how long ago the Mythic Age was, but it was a while. And it makes sense because these bones are huge. And in the Mythic Age, there were monsters and giants and heroes and all that cool stuff wandering around. So it makes sense that these huge bones would come from that time long ago. People in the ancient world, when they found these fossiles, these cool little things that seem to come out of the ground out of nowhere, they generally would dedicate them as offerings to a local god, to a local temple. And so some temples in the ancient world kind of became these precursors to natural history museums. They would just have these collections of all this cool stuff that people just found. And the bones were no exception, especially because the bones were thought to come from this mythical era, to come from these monsters and these gods and these heroes. It made perfect sense for people to dedicate them to their local temple or shrine, or in some cases to even build a shrine specifically for these bones. Now, later when the emperors come around, they start to collect some of this stuff for themselves, so it moves away from the temples a little bit and becomes recollected in palaces, but in both cases, it's kind of cool that we have these collections being formed. So, for example, on the island of Samos, there was a temple to Hera, and there they kept the bones of the monster of Samos. So apparently someone in the ancient world found these. It wasn't a full skeleton, just a skull and a thigh bone, but both of them are about twice the size of a typical human skull and thigh bone. So very big. They thought it belonged to some kind of monster and they kept it in this temple. And the bones have actually survived. You can still go see them. They're on the island of Samos. They actually apparently just keep them in a back room of their post office, which is kind of funny and random, but there it is. And modern scientists have examined these bones and they have identified them as belonging to some type of giant prehistoric giraffe. And it seems like they actually named the species after the bones. So the giraffe is called the Samotherium, which is pretty cool. For our next monster, we have a quote from Pliny's Natural History. Scourgeis, in his aedileship, exhibited at Rome, among other wonderful things, the bones of the monster to which Andromeda was said to have been exposed, and which he had brought from Joppa, a city of Judea. These bones exceeded 40 feet in length, and the ribs were higher than those of an Indian elephant, while the backbone was 1.5 feet in thickness. So these bones were originally found and kept in Joppa, but the Romans, being the lovely, respectful people that they were, decided to take these bones back to Rome to show off. And I can't blame them too much because 40 feet is freaking long. That is really impressive. And these bones have not survived, so we can't analyze them, but the best guess as to what they may have been is some kind of whale. Next, we have the Caledonian boar, which was a giant pig in Greek myth that terrorized a bunch of people and took a whole crew of heroes to bring down. Apparently, there was a temple of Athena in Tegea, Greece that claimed to have the tusks of this boar. Now, we don't have them because at some point, Augustus decided that he wanted them, so he relocated them and then they were lost after that. But Pausanias tells us that he saw them and they were 3 feet long. They probably didn't belong to an actual boar, though. Scientists have found some other elephant tusks near that city, Tegea, so it's possible / likely that what they found were elephant bones. Finally, we're going to take a look at a mysterious and somewhat controversial vase painting that depicts what is generally just called the monster of Troy. So the story behind this is that Poseidon was annoyed at the Trojans. This happens a little ways before the Trojan War. He's annoyed at the Trojans and he decides to send a sea monster to torment them. And in order to appease Poseidon and the sea monster, they have to sacrifice their princess. So they set her out there. And I know this sounds a lot like the myth of Perseus, but this is actually a different story because Heracles ends up saving her. So similar, but different. What's interesting about this particular portrayal of the myth is that it doesn't portray the monster as a serpent or a dragon. And we have images of those things elsewhere, and it doesn't look like how the Greeks normally portray those things. It looks like this weird other thing. Who knows what it is or what it's supposed to be. And what Adrian and some others have proposed is that this is inspired by these giant monster bones that people in the ancient world saw in their temples. So it's supposed to look like one of these skulls. Now, it doesn't look like any skull that we know of, but the theory is that it's not supposed to be a portrayal of one particular skull, that somebody had seen different skulls of whales, of snakes, of birds, and it just sort of was inspired by all of these and made a composite of them. Monsters in the ancient world are often composites of multiple things like the chimera, etc. So it would make sense for somebody to just make the most terrifying skull they possibly could, but they were still inspired by these skulls. So that's why it's white, that's why it has these giant eye sockets, that sort of thing. So this is probably the least conclusive thing on our list, but it's still definitely very interesting. Thank you so much for checking out this video. A special thank you, as always, to subscribers and to Patreon members, and I hope to see all of you again next week. Hαίrete.